See him?
Great. And today we're talking about the boomerang effect and what that might mean and how we might use or where we might land with the boomerang effect, what we're all looking for. So, what I mean by boomerang effect, and we have a little different ideas about what this means. So, this might be fun to start talking about in a moment. But to me, when we have had contractions of rights and in our society, or we've had fights over rights in our society, like the Civil War, and then we boomerang beyond that to Reconstruction and had a real expansion of rights, and then there was a backlash against that. We're still fighting that one. But also like McCarthyism, we had this real backlash or this real contraction of rights with McCarthyism, and yet we propelled forward, not even just to where the rights that we had to before that happened, but that brought about civil rights and women's rights, and the whole movement forward with the Vietnam War, anti-war movement, and anti-war movements in general. As a reaction to World War II, and so it's not so much a boom or a backlash as much as it is, the time that we contract or the time that things are crumbling or falling apart, kind of like they are now, gives us the opportunity to really look and see what is it that we truly want. What is it that we're willing to embody? What is the kind of future we want to hold? And so, we have a contraction of a lot of things now, everything from rights to the, income inequality, to crumbling infrastructure, to wars, to, the oligarchy class, the billionaire class kind of running everything, to AI, to everything else, and jobs crisis and population crisis and all of these things. And that really gives us a chance to take a look at and consider what do we really want, because at some point we are going to not be willing to contract anymore, and we are going to expand into something else. And so I that was what my idea of boomerang forward was. And so, Henry, what was your idea of when we started talking about this, what the boomerang effect might be?
Well, when you said you wanted to talk next time about the boomerang that's coming, I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. And I thought boomerang is a much better term than backlash
Hmm.
because, to me, the word backlash is basically a way of characterizing one tribe reacting to another tribe. That's the
Hmm.
way I think of it, because it's this whole thing of Barack Obama was a backlash to George W. Bush, and then Donald Trump was a backlash to Barack Obama. And I think that right now, a lot of things are going to happen in addition to one tribe reacting to the other tribe.
Yeah.
In fact, I actually think that for a while is going to look like so much of the country is aligned, because the country is going to be focused on the things that we actually all agree, that most of us agree on.
Hmm.
Most people oppose the war. Most people think billionaires should pay higher taxes or pay any taxes. And so, I think that for a while, it's going to look as if, wow, the American people seem to be pretty aligned on at least these two issues.
Hmm.
And the reason why I say though, and I think boomerang applies to that more so than backlash, is because for most people to be aligned on those two issues, then you're going to have people who are normally associated with one tribe or the other all basically sounding as if they agree. And so
Hmm.
that's what I was thinking of. Now, what you're saying, the way that you characterize a boomerang is sort of interesting, because what you're saying, it sounds to me like what you're doing is you're looking beyond what's happening right now.
Oh yeah.
So right now, people have been losing rights, starting with, bodily autonomy, and now with, voting rights and so on. And you have state assemblies doing everything they could to make sure that certain people can't vote.
Right.
And what you're saying is that what's going to happen is in the future that this step backward is going to be multiple steps forward, because it gives people an opportunity to sort of think, you know what, I really think this is what I believe. This is what I actually believe, as a reaction to this attempt to bring us back.
Yeah,
So
and the what do I really want? And I actually see it beyond just individual countries, because so much of what's happening in our poly crisis is global. You know, we've got
well,
a
that's true.
global population problem apparently. We've got global energy issues. We've got global financial issues. We've got global supply chain issues. We've got, you know, all kinds of things that are global, and a group of, we talked about younger people before, of young people who are kind of, they've missed, or they seem to be missing out on all of the things that allows you to progress through, you know, the normal sort of markers of adulthood, you know, relationships and children and careers and that kind of stuff. And then also the inability to afford to live, everything's getting more expensive. So you have not just things in individual countries, but you have movements globally. And so part of this boomerang effect, I think, you know, especially with the war in Iran, we're having all of these energy issues. And the boomerang effect might be, hey, we need to be completely independent of a single kind of fuel. You know, we need to have active localized grids. We need to have multiple ways of powering those grids. We need to have, you know, not have, give all of our autonomy over to AI and billionaires, is we need to be able to have people who can, you know, make a living and contribute in meaningful ways. And we need to bring it back to the human side of things and not just cede our entire lives to technology. And even a backlash against, you know, global surveillance and, you know, all of these kinds of things that we have. I shouldn't say backlash, boomerang beyond all those things, because a lot of stuff that is coming to light now are things that people don't want, and they don't want them, like you say, universally or almost universally. And so, you know, at some point we need to, or we will, in my view, and this, I mean, and I'm more in like a 5 to 10 to 15 year kind of trajectory with how we sort these things out. It's not so much, you know, the next voting cycle or the next 2 or 3 years, but as a world community, and or blocks of nations, to be able to say no. You know, like we're having a backlash in the US right now against data centers. A lot of them have been pared back because people do not want them. And so they're saying no, which is a backlash, but then we need to decide, well, what are we saying yes to? You know, because backlashes are always about saying no. And I think a boomerang is
Hmm.
about saying yes. And we are not as good at identifying those things that we want to say yes to. We are very conditioned to backlash against the things that we don't like. But having kind of not a uniform, that's not a good idea, but a coherent vision or sense of moving forward is, I think, something that carries us forward as a boomerang. So that we have certain human rights, which we've talked about, that, you know, we have a certain level of income parity so that everybody can afford to live. So that, you know, we have you know, those kinds of things. What can we agree on, even if we don't agree on the same, the way that we get there, because not everybody's going to be the same. But what can we agree on and find common ground on and find coherence in, that moves us beyond the backlash and moves us, you know, propels us forward into the next part of our common story.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about what you just said in terms of the youth and their concerns, one big concern that I would have if I were in my 20s is, am I going to have a livable planet?
Hmm.
And, you know, it's fascinating. This huge energy shock is having a fascinating effect because, I mean, there are places, there are countries that have basically said, whoa, 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 wait a second. We need to basically go from fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels to get up for mobility to, you know, to EVs. And
Hmm.
they're saying, look, placing huge orders to China, just send us every single EV you can send
Yeah.
us. And we're going to basically dump all these cars, you know, all of these, you know, gas burning cars.
Hmm.
And I can see that happening in a lot of places, including the United States of America. I mean, there are people reporting, you know, $5 a gallon gas, you know,
Right.
$6 a gallon gas, depending on where you live in the US. If you were to actually open up the market to Chinese EVs,
Mm-hmm.
cars that look great, and that really look like they're fun to drive, and yet they're affordable.
Mm-hmm.
I could see, people who before this were talking about, oh, I don't like electric cars, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, now they want the BYD car, and they're not even necessarily thinking of it as an electric car. They're just thinking it's a really cool car
Yeah.
that's not going to cost me $120 to fill up, you know.
Right. But at the
So,
same time with
it's really what's that?
at the same time with that though is that's kind of a surface level thing of people reacting or responding and choosing electric cars because of the fossil fuel shock, but then how do you create the electricity to power those cars? Because like you've
Well,
got
that's true. That's
there was
true.
a story, and I just breezed through it, but it was somehow there's a city or a town of about 49,000 people in California that are on the Nevada electrical grid, but it kind of covers over in California. But there's a new data center coming to Nevada that's going to basically take all that electricity, but that's the grid that they're connected to. So they are all of a sudden faced with the idea of having no electricity because there is this data center coming in, taking all of that stuff and then boosting the price of it for everybody else. But them at the end of the road, they don't have any electricity. And so how do you respond to those things? And I think that's kind of the deeper question is how do we create sort of microgrids and things or yeah, I guess microgrids where you're not as dependent upon all of these massive grids to be able to get your electricity to you. So whether it's cities or towns working on microgrids and ensuring their own electricity in various ways, depending, I mean, some places could be geothermal, some places could be natural gas, some places could be solar, some places could be hydroelectric. But unless you really figure out ways to deliver electricity, that's just the next way that you can be controlled by centralized power, even if it's not centralized fossil fuels. So, to me, six of one, half a dozen another until you solve the problem of energy generally and having some autonomy over it as a town or a city, and you're not necessarily being beholden to the giant energy suppliers.
Well, it sounds like to me though that you're focusing on the motivation. So, in other words, instead of being motivated by the high cost of fuel
Mhm.
and cool cars
Yeah.
and the cost of the cars and the
Hmm.
cost of the cars, you're saying um, uh, we might see a situation where people are finally motivated by positive ideas like renewable energy as an idea, as opposed to new jobs in the community or cheaper prices for electricity, which are all kind of pragmatic reasons. They're pragmatic motivations. Whereas what you're saying is you think that the ideology will become more appealing, or at least will have a certain valence now. Is that a
Well,
good way to
I don't
interpret what
like the
you're
word
saying?
ideology because I don't like the word ideology, but kind of, but it's more that because all of those pragmatic motivators are valuable. They all make sense. They're all, something that could go into things. But if we only react to things, if we only switch from fossil fuel cars to electric cars because all of a sudden gas is expensive and electricity is not as expensive, then you're just transferring, dependency on one fossil fuel to dependency on another kind of power. And so when you actually are thinking about what do we really want, if we want to have areas or, portions of states or portions of cities that have more electrical autonomy or more energy autonomy, that's a positive kind of thing. So how do we then design this? And what does this mean? And so it does include jobs. It does include lower costs. It does include being able to have, a grid that you can count on. It does being all of those things make sense in there. But instead of reacting to something because I need to do this because of this, like in the 1970s, we had these gas guzzling cars. We had this crisis in the, this oil crisis. And then all of a sudden we were buying these little tiny Japanese cars, which was great for the Japanese car makers, the Toyota, Honda, all of those. I mean, they really boomed and that kind of have stuck around. And then gas dropped again, and then we go back to the big cars, and then the gas goes up or increases in price. We go back to the small cars, and these are just reactions at the surface level versus, well, what do we actually want? And that's what I'm thinking in the Boomerang, and there's a lot of people thinking about this, but they might need a backlash in order to get support to make it happen. So I think a lot of motivations come together in these things, but mostly when we react to something, we're just lurching from one thing to another thing versus thinking about something in a more holistic way. Like if we want to be, say if a city wants to, this city of 49,000 people wants to have continuous electricity, be fairly autonomous with that, not be beholden to a grid where the data center can take all of their stuff. And how might they begin to plan that? What they begin to do? What resources are available to create that? And so that's the kind of thinking to me, ideally, that is beneath the Boomerang. They might catch the wave of a backlash that would support that, but without thinking things through that way, then you just get one band-aid or another band-aid, another band-aid, another band-aid, and it just, the beat goes on, and usually it's then the big players that benefit from that. And that's
Can
actually,
you can well, no, I agree with that last thing. Can you name a time in American history where we did what you're talking about?
we got rid of leaded gas. We got rid of refrigerants that were causing the ozone layer, the ozone hole in the ozone layer. There's been things that we've done because we've needed to do them for our own self-preservation. And so we've come together to do those things on a proactive basis. And those were, international treaties and, national incentives and things like that. But I remember growing up in Southern California, there was this hill that you could come over from where I lived over down into, the Whittier area. And that would lead down to, I was up in the foothills, and it would lead down to the ocean. And when you were coming down that hill, all you would see was brown, gunky smog all through the 70s. It was horrible. And you'd have, even as a kid in school, you'd have these days where you couldn't go outside. There were smog alerts. There was smog alerts regularly, and you couldn't go outside to play at recess because the smog was too bad. And if you did do it, like I remember playing sports and stuff when there was having some smog issues, and you'd start coughing and things because it was bad for your lungs. And now every time you come over that hill, because they changed leaded gasoline and the particulates in the air, and was really trying to clean up the environment, the air pollution and things, you always can see. You can always see down, not all the way to the ocean because that's too far, but you're coming over that hill and it's beautiful. It used to be that you couldn't see from the top of the hill from where I lived to the mountains behind us. And, you could see them maybe sometimes after rain on a clear day. But you couldn't see them regularly, but now you can always see them. So that's something
So
that we
when you
did.
well, when you okay, so when you say we did, um, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering, because my understanding of like policy in the U.S. at least is
Hmm.
that you have certain stakeholders
Hmm.
or maybe advocacy groups which promote a certain policy. I mean, nowadays you literally have wealthy stakeholders that purchase the
Yeah. And
implementation of a policy.
that's a
You know, I
newer
mean,
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
right, right. I mean, that's what's happening with the data centers. I mean, basically, like you have about seven companies that have bought the implementation of the build out of these data centers.
Yeah.
They just bought that policy.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, I can. What you're talking about reminds me of stuff like the advocacy that was done with regard to seatbelts, or the advocacy that was
Mhm.
done with regard to drinking while driving, or the advocacy that was done with regard to smoking, and so
Mhm.
there was these long periods of time where you have different types of specialists which would do all these studies, people would write papers and so on, and it just kind of crescendoed into a point where it was you had to basically deny the logic and deny the common sense of going in one direction versus another direction. You basically had to you had to say, no, I don't want to do it. I don't care what you say. Yeah, they just deny all of the science and so on and say, no, I can't do it. And that was overwhelmed in those
Mhm.
situations. Um, and so, I mean, is that what you think is going to happen this time with regard to a bunch of these issues related to artificial intelligence and war and wealth inequality and stuff like that? Is that what you're
Well,
thinking of?
it's what I hope happens. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but I do think, one of the things that keeps coming back to me, and especially now, we're in this real contraction of rights and a real contraction of democracy because, you've had a lot of states that have voted on their level not to have gerrymandering, or not to have, or to allow abortion and bodily autonomy in their constitution, that are actively being dismantled by the people who are in state power. So you've got
Right.
this whole thing where it doesn't really matter, being what you vote for anymore doesn't matter, because whoever's in charge, and they don't have to really run. They just have to win the primary, because there's so many safe seats. Although that might be an interesting thing, that with all this new gerrymandering, it may not work out quite as well as they think. But for all of those issues and the issues that we're in now, it took the public really demanding something. It took them pressing the politicians, and it took enough of a wave of people and a wave of um, people saying no to one thing and yes to something else, for policies to shift and change in a particular direction. And I think ultimately, oh, the thing that I kept coming back to is that, government only works by the consent of the governed. So, at some point, if you either have so much government rule against people, they will backlash out of that. They will figure out a way to shift out of that one way or another. So if the Soviet Union fell because it had its own issues, and then a lot of the Soviet states, created leapt forward in a lot of different ways. I don't know in our government now, because of the way that it's currently set up, but there's a lot of dissatisfaction with it all across the board. With the Supreme Court, with the administration, with the Congress and the legislative branch, with local and state governments, with, government really very obviously being in it for their own enrichment, or their own sense of power and their own sense of control and their own fever dream of whatever it is that they think they're doing, that a majority of people, and a big majority of people, disagree with. And so at some point, where does that disagreement begin to shift and change those structures? I don't know where we are in that process or how that might look. But society works on the consent of those of us in society. So when enough people are dissatisfied with what's going on, things change one way or another. And I
Well,
think
well,
we're
to
kind of
me,
in that place.
the key thing about right now is that enough people are dissatisfied in the same direction. And that's
Mhm.
why I started off by saying that, instead of fighting over abortion or immigration or gun rights, I think that right now, so many people are impacted by the rising gas prices. So many people, are angry that the U.S. military is now conducting, a war on for reasons that don't seem to have anything to do with us.
Yeah.
I think so many people agree on those basic things and are
Hmm.
focusing on those things and not the other list of things that we tend to fight over.
Yeah.
That's what I mean when I said that it's going to look like alignment
Yeah.
for at least a little while.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, I mean, I think at least, a large majority of people feel like the billionaires are out of control.
Hmm.
A large majority of people feel that way. A large,
Yeah.
what I said about like buying a policy, I can see 20 years ago I would have, a lot of people would have disagreed with that and had all these reasons why that's ridiculous. Whereas right now it's literally obvious. It's just
Yeah.
obvious
And it's
that
out in the open.
the
It's not even hidden.
it's
It's
not
just
even
right
hidden.
out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's almost like they might as well brag about it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just how bad it is,
Yeah.
right? And so, that's what I'm thinking in terms of is going to happen. But the other thing that occurred to me when you sort of mentioned these different movements, or at least when I brought up the list of movements, and then you reacted to that list, is people kind of support certain movements for a variety of reasons. It kind of reminds me of my how I came to understand as an adult, how a person might actually get a lot of things out of being a member of a particular religious community besides the ideals and the belief system
Yeah.
ostensibly that community holds with regard to religion. They
Yeah.
might just like going for the companionship of the people in that community. They might maybe that community dresses a certain way and they might like that style. They may actually
Right.
like, you know, the way it feels to look like a person who belongs to this particular community. They might
Hmm.
think that that's just cool,
Yeah.
or they might like the community might have a music that's behind it, and they
Hmm.
might like that music, and so it's gonna those are the things. That's why I asked a question about, were you saying that you think that people are going to, and I didn't know that you didn't like the word ideology. I'd like
Oh,
to know
well,
why that is.
yeah.
But
Just because it's so, I don't know. It's hard. I'd have to think about why I don't like it. I think it's because it's both trying to define something in a very simple, easy way, and it's because it's our ideas about something versus necessarily a grounding in reality. But well, that's a conversation for another time.
well, okay. But I guess, okay. So, but you're saying that you think people are going to be on the same page. Is that a good way to characterize what you
Okay.
think is going to happen in terms of the boomerang that's coming?
Well, I agree with you that a lot of people are that there seems like we have a lot of common ground because people are dissatisfied
In the same
in the
direction,
same
with the
direction.
same things in the
And
same
they,
direction.
yeah. But what I was talking about in terms of like um, the thought process that that gives us something to move forward into is that we can have the backlash, we can have the reaction to it. We don't like the war. Well, then what do we want instead of that? But you actually need, in order to actually create something in a thoughtful way, you need to have something to move toward. So, like the civil
Hmm.
rights movement, people wanted and needed civil rights. So there was a reaction against civil rights. It was a whole historical thing against civil rights. But we had an idea of what civil rights looked like. And so we knew the direction we were going in that for the people who were coming together from different walks of life and different, for different reasons, coming together to support civil rights. We had a sense of what that would look like. We had a set of really laws and ideals about what that might look like. But moving forward from here, when this boomerang effect, when we have a lot of dissatisfaction about where things are, we actually need some things to say, yes, I like this particular kind of movement forward. So if we're just awash in our own dissatisfaction, then we get a lot of dissatisfaction. But that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of groups coming together to try to create some frameworks for moving forward in ways that people can say, yeah, I don't like that, but I kind of like this, or this is the menu of things that maybe the direction we can move toward, and people can kind of choose in the movement forward that is most interesting to them. Um,
Well,
but
actually, you
without
bringing up,
go ahead.
but you're bringing up the civil rights movement is kind of what it, it it relates to what I'm trying to get at, which is
Mhm.
when you say we had an idea of civil rights, well, some people did, but that idea was an alternative to the idea that people had against civil rights.
Mhm.
So in other words, the only reason why the idea of how things could be had any valence was because of the society that denied those rights to
Right.
certain groups of people.
Mhm.
So I mean, and so like I said, I think that this is a moment where you don't actually have as much disagreement about like the basic ideas like that, where you have
Yeah.
like a society that says, no, I like things the way they are. I like having the advantage. I like these people being in the position that they're in. No, that's what I want. Then you have other people saying, well, no, that's morally wrong, or
Mhm.
that's not even necessarily economically wise for
Right.
these reasons. Right now, you actually have a lot of people that are saying, I don't want this war, so we should
Mhm.
stop and we should get out of it. And a
Mhm.
lot of people saying, I want billionaires to pay more in taxes. Just full stop, clear cut. And so, I mean, the people who disagree with that are like the billionaires who are not anywhere near
Yeah.
a majority. They're a big they have the money, the lion's share of the money, but they don't have they're not a big number of people. And the same thing when it comes to opposition to the war. I mean, you basically have like a majority of people who oppose the war for different reasons, but you
Mhm.
still have a majority that oppose it. So, I mean, that's why I think those two issues are different from a long list of
Right.
issues where you'll have it's easy to kind of activate people against a particular movement. You have people who say, well, this is right and correct and moral. You'll have people who say, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And they may not even necessarily talk in right, correct, moral terms. It's just like I oppose that. you know
Okay, so let's to go back. Let's go with the billionaires paying more taxes, and most people can agree that that needs to happen. But what does it look like when they do that? What is that tax money used for? Is it just used to, enrich other people, and is it used to, move more money from the taxpayer to the shareholder pipeline, or is it used to give services to people? Is it used to, so what is that money used for? So you might need to agree that they need to pay more money, but then what's the vision of how that money is used in a way that benefits citizens versus
well,
just more money
that's
that they,
exactly.
yeah, okay,
No, I hear what you're saying, and that's
yeah,
exactly why I say it. The country will look aligned for a
hmm,
time,
yeah.
and then all of a sudden it wouldn't necessarily be aligned.
No,
Because
so I
I
think
agree
we
with you.
need those
People
things.
will disagree on that.
Yeah, but that's why I think we need some of those points moving forward. The people who can hold out visions, and nobody's really doing this even on a political level. There's a lot of politics around, contraction, but there's not that many, the shining city on a hill kind of ideas about this is what we could build and this is how we could do it and this is the vision that we're moving forward. Everything's like, well, we're not that person. There was like, well, we're not Biden, well, we're not Trump, and everybody's running on those things versus like laying out a vision of what actually life could be like, if we came together and backed certain kinds of visions. So there's just not, I don't see much leadership, um, public or private, that is out there, that are big names. But I mean, there's a lot going on under the surface that I think might rise as the occasion warrants it. But I don't
Well,
really,
there actually is a bit. I agree with you that in terms of what you and I would characterize as a positive vision
hmm,
doesn't exist,
yeah,
or at least I don't know of one. But
yeah,
there is a vision being put forward, and that vision I mean, and that, I mean, I could name the people, but when I describe the vision, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. That vision is to have a country where one profile of person
Mhm.
based on their gender and their race is in charge of everything,
Yeah.
and then another profile of person is submissive directly to that person,
Mhm.
and then as a unit, they are in charge of everybody else. I
Right.
mean, that's a very clear vision
It is.
being put forward right now and implemented. Actually,
Yes,
that
and
vision is being
implement.
implemented.
Yeah.
The thing is that it's not popular,
No, but there's
and
no
it's also
alternative vision.
that's true. No, I agree with you. And I
Yeah.
think the reason why a lot of the stakeholders, the people who are normal, the people who are actually opposing that particular, the groups that are putting forward that vision,
Mhm.
the reason why they're not putting forward an alternative vision is because they're going the safe route.
Yeah.
They're trying to avoid alienating certain people, because if you put forward a positive anti-war vision
Mhm.
that's based on, say, like diversity and inclusion and tolerance and stuff like that,
Yeah.
you might alienate people who are against the war because they hate certain groups of people. So they don't want equality. They're just against the war. In fact, their hatreds are part of the reason why they're against the war in the first
Mhm.
place. So I mean, I think that's the reason why you have these stakeholders right now who are not putting forth a vision, because they're afraid of alienating groups of people who will agree with them on the criticism. They have
Yeah.
the same. They're making the same judgment. They're just, but they're not likely to. They're afraid that they're not going to agree on this positive,
Mhm.
vision that you're talking about. That's the reason why I think people aren't putting it out there.
Well, that's true. And there's also, I just finished the book. What does it call it? If anyone builds it, everyone will die. It's AI and
Oh
particularly
yeah, yeah, yeah. You
AI.
read it? Oh, okay.
Oh my gosh.
I've
Yeah.
seen the
Very
guy. I've seen
interesting
the
book.
guy do the. I've seen him in interviews.
I have, yeah.
It is pretty scary. Yeah.
It is scary. Now, I hopefully I'm hopeful in that we can figure that out and use AI for good and blah blah blah. And that one of the points they make at the end of the book is that, when they talk to politicians, most of them are on board with the idea that super intelligent AI is not a good idea and that it is dangerous, but they will not say it out loud for those same reasons, because they're afraid of being kind of that lone voice sort of in the darkness saying we can't do this, and not and then they lose funding and they do all this stuff, or they seem like they're a kook or whatever. But and it's kind of
Wait,
that
wait. Let me
same.
stop you there. In the
Yeah.
book, that they distinguish between politicians who don't want to say it because they don't want to alienate their donors, or politicians who don't want to say it because they don't want to alienate voters. Because I actually think most voters agree with that. I think
Right.
most
I
voters
think.
agree with that, but
Yeah,
the
they didn't want to
donors
be
may not
seen
agree.
as the kooks out there, and and their donors, yes, the donors, and the political wins. Basically, they don't want to go against the political wins, which is all
Yeah,
about
but the
currently. We need to do it first. We need to get super intelligence first, so that we can kill everybody, because then at least we're in charge of killing everybody. So,
I don't think
you
that's the way
know,
most voters feel. I
no, it's
really
not.
don't.
And I think that if you have, and the point they were making too is, if you have some politicians who got together who were like, this, we need to really take this seriously. This is how we need to take it seriously. This is what our vision for AI is. This is how we need to rein it in. And
Hmm.
particularly if it is, multinational and not just, politicians or one country, that they would have a very powerful movement forward, even if it's just on that one issue, because everything touches that issue. Power touches that issue. I mean, both political
Hmm.
power and energy power, and the future of work, the future of humanity, healthcare, food, like everything touches that issue.
War touches
War
that
touches
issue.
that issue. Um, and if like we don't have to necessarily have a poly issue vision, but if we had people talking about a vision with this one thing, particularly when you include, AI taking people's jobs, and what does that mean? What does employment actually mean? And, how do we because everybody's like, all the AI guys are like, oh yeah, it'll be great. People won't have to work as much, and we'll have AI doing everything for us, and yeah, they'll figure that job stuff out. But in the meantime, if everybody, starves to death because nobody has a job, that'll be fine. Because there's nobody solving that problem. They figure somebody else is going to solve that problem. But if you have people coming together who are across nationalities, across party lines, and everything else, even with a vision for something like AI. I think that could be a galvanizing vision that stakeholders could then, even if they disagree with other things, could be like, yes, we need to do this one thing, and we move together with this one thing, and then we sort this other stuff out, as we move forward. But I think that is probably the one thing that could move us forward in a huge boomerang, is to have some coherent vision around AI with some teeth that were attached to that.
Okay, I think I understand. I have a better understanding of what you mean when you say boomerang, because you keep saying move us forward.
Hmm.
So it sounds to me like what you're trying to characterize is something that will, like I said, bring us together.
Yeah.
A lot of people will or would support it, that kind
Hmm.
of thing. It's interesting because I didn't read the book, like I said, but I did. I saw the author in several interviews,
Hmm.
and I guess no one asked him the question as to why he thinks that politicians are afraid to come out against against AGI, because I mean I'm really surprised to hear that, because like I said, most people are that I've talked to, they're against it, or at least they're
Yeah.
very concerned about it. Let's put it like that. So, if anything, to me, it's an issue that would actually gain you a lot of traction because a lot of people agree with you. I don't know whether people would necessarily vote for you over another person because of that, though. I mean, maybe that's the issue. Maybe it's not an issue that would distinguish them from a competitor for the office. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Um, so maybe that's what's actually going on. But I actually do believe, I agree with you that you can definitely mobilize a plurality of people
Hmm.
based on concerns about AI. Because I don't know that people necessarily want it to end or stop, or they oppose it or all that kind of stuff. People just don't like the idea that you have such a small group of people,
Hmm.
and some of them seem kind of wacky.
They don't
They
like people.
seem,
There's people who don't like people.
yeah,
People who
exactly.
like
People who don't
control
like people.
machines better than people. So, and yet
Yeah,
they're making decisions on behalf of humanity.
exactly, exactly. And I mean, there's even a lot of evidence that, some of the people behind this, at least, if not the majority, don't really think the human race has a future. And so,
Yeah.
they're doing this partly because they don't think there's a future. That's the reason why they're building bunkers in Hawaii and stuff like
Hmm.
that. Um, so I really do think that that you can mobilize a plurality of people against just reckless AI development.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean that's interesting. I didn't read the book though. I just saw interviews with that guy.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not I listened to it, as an audiobook. It's only like 6 hours, so it's not real long. But I don't even necessarily think it would require, actually, I think it's probably better, if it's not necessarily a political movement as much as it is a leadership movement. So if, you've got particular whatever, whether they're authors, people coming up with books that, like, books that move the needle with certain things. And I'll go back, actually, that book and movie, Project Hail Mary. There was, because it's always been, aliens have always been presented as the enemy. That we see the
mhm,
enemy, we shoot first, and then we justify our actions, and then we ponder whether that was a good idea later. And in
mhm,
Project Hail Mary, a human and a very non-human like alien have to work together in order to survive and save humanity and Earth and the other alien world. And it presented, like we talked about before, that feeling state of, wow, maybe aliens, maybe we could get along with aliens. And so that book opened up that door. So there could be, something from an author. It could be a popular thing like a movie. It could be a popular person, a famous person. It could be business leaders. It could be political leaders. It could be all kinds of different people who can put together a coherent vision for people to say yes to this and no to this. And part of it would be with AI is the difference between like using ChatGPT to help you write better letters, which is a perfectly great use for AI, or to help diagnose diseases or solve cancer, or do solve a lot of our problems, versus the AGI or the superintelligence that can actually act on its own and do all kinds of crazy stuff. So being able to talk about that, how you work with jobs, how you talk about it in, or create a vision that is sort of multidisciplinary. And then people begin to buy into that vision. And if people begin to buy into that vision and begin to think about that and organize around that, then politicians, because they always follow, they don't lead, especially at this point. We don't have leaders, we have followers, and then people who take advantage of the system to galvanize people will follow. But I think, we actually need some form of coherent vision for people to say yes to, and not just always saying, no, I don't want this, and reacting to what they don't want. Because without something to reach toward, we just lurch from side to side and never really get anything done.
Well, I mean, I can't help but note that for the second time you've done something interesting where you said you don't like the word ideology,
Yeah.
and then like a little bit later on, like just a little while ago, you said, well, not necessarily politics, but leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting way to do it because in a way, it reminds me of how America has socialism, but
Mm-hmm.
that socialism is actually just for wealthy people and corporations.
Absolutely.
so, so we don't call
Well,
it socialism. It's not the
right.
kind of socialism that you normally think of when you think of socialism.
Right.
And so it's almost like not calling a thing or the thing that it actually is. There's an advantage to that in some ways. Um,
All right. So this is what the ideology, why I don't like it. Ideology to me is a closed loop. Right? So it is an idea, and these are the things that, this is the idea, these are the justifications for the idea, this is we follow. So we follow this idea,
mhm.
where it becomes a closed loop of things, and you're always justifying the idea and looking at things relative to that idea. Like, no socialism in the United States, which is just complete BS. But we don't have socialism, so we're always, that's not part of our ideology. But that was a little sidetrack. Whereas leadership is not necessarily presenting something as a closed loop. They're presenting an idea in which we are always creating within that idea, and expanding and shifting, and as things don't work, you can move to something that more does work. To me, leadership is kind of a creative path forward. Ideology is a closed loop. And that's what I really don't like about it. It is like you have an idea, everything has to adhere to that idea, regardless of what reality is. And leadership to me is kind of moving forward with a general guiding principle where you're always having to readjust as facts on the ground or reality changes.
Okay, so that last part, facts on the ground, sounds like the leadership that you're thinking of is using empirical data. So in other words, it's leadership that kind of is within the framework of the Enlightenment. You're basically you have these certain theories, you test out your theory, and you try to use in intelligence and intellectualism to work through rational. You try to do it in a rational way, as opposed to the religious framework where you're thinking more in terms of morality and what's right and
Or
what's
even
wrong and what's
political
moral and
ideology.
what's immoral.
Even political
What's that?
ideology, even political ideology. You know, you've got this siloed set of ideas that, you know, one side is part of, and this siloed part of ideas that this other side is part of. Never mind that that they've completely abandoned them. You know, it's always, it comes back to these talking points about what that ideology is, and that is kind of this closed loop. Like you look at Project 2025 as a closed loop ideology. It is, this is the way that we envision the world. This is how we're going to create the world that we envision, whether people
Mm-hmm.
want it or not, whether it has any merit or not, whether, you know, it is its own closed loop, and it always refers back to itself for authority. And so religion does that, politics does that. There's a lot of things that do that, and that's where my problem with ideology comes from, because it's not dynamic, it is static. And
Well,
I
I guess what I'm
dynamic.
wondering though is how do you get away from that though? Because right now I can't think of a institution or organization or system that is true to the ideas that the system or institution was built on. So just like you said, how like there's this debate right now, depending on what news you watch or what media you watch, as to whether or not we actually have a capitalist system.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't feel like capitalism.
No.
It doesn't really look like capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is it really capitalism? What is it? It kind of looks more like, in terms of the financial market, that looks more like gambling. In terms of the way corporations operate, it looks a lot more like, a monopoly system, almost like a feudal system.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I can't really think of anything that's actually operating on the basis of the ideas that built that system in the first place. And so I don't know that that we're dealing
I
with
don't
in an
think we have.
ideological environment. To be honest with you, was that?
Okay. So, all right. Well, I think ideology has been kind of, we're operating on a lot of older ideologies that are breaking down. So, but we still kind of come back to the ideology, in my view. You know, we're always coming back to, oh, the Republicans do this, the Democrats do this, the economy is this. It doesn't matter that reality doesn't match up to it, because we don't look at reality, we look at the ideology, because reality is a little too complicated for people to deal with. And then if you're dealing with reality and you don't have an ideology, it's just chaos. It feels a little bit like chaos. Um, and I don't think we have really that any kind of functioning ideological, or I won't even say not ideological, but leadership kind of system. I think we have had some of those in the past. And if you think about, like, the United Nations, or League of Nations before it was United Nations, at the time it was
Hmm.
created, it was a leadership organization. Now it got the legs pulled out on it, and it was never allowed to expand into anything more than sort of being a body of people that didn't really get much done. But it had the potential to do that at the time, until it was didn't wasn't given the power that it needed to. And so I don't know. I don't want to argue about ideology. In my mind, ideology is is something that we cling to despite reality, which I think is what's happening now. But this whole idea of leadership moving forward, I don't think we have anything that's functioning in that at the moment, and we're kind of waiting for that person, or that situation, or that idea to rise to help us galvanize something moving forward. And I don't think we have that at the moment. So I'm holding out hope.
Well, I guess I think the reason though is that it would be very difficult to come up with something that isn't in reality what's been around before. So to come up with something that is truly different from whatever the systems have been in the past. I mean, I do agree that we're probably going to wind up with. I mean, because right now what we have are systems, like we both seem to agree that the systems were built on certain, certain ideas, a certain belief system, certain beliefs, but they don't resemble those original beliefs at all.
No.
Um, and and I do agree that if we can just go from that Frankenstein monster being destructive to being functional for more people. If we can just go from that to something that is functional, it's going to involve a combination of things. It's going to look a little bit like socialism, a little bit like capitalism, a little bit like this, a little bit like that. I mean, I think that's what we're going to wind up with. So I agree with that. But in terms of characterizing it, or sort of moving forward, or even the dialogue that's necessary to sort of build this thing, I don't know how you can talk about it without talking about the things that have already been discussed. I mean, I just don't see how it can be done.
Well, maybe that becomes part of the conversation. I don't know, but we're, with the advent of AI and all of the issues, just to harken back to that, that are related to that, we are stepping into a world where we've never been in this place before. There's not really something we can point to and say, that's, that's similar to AI. I mean, even the computer, when we became computerized, was nothing like what AI could bring us to. And so if
Yeah,
we, go ahead.
no, I agree with that in the sense that, from what I understand, and I think the guy that you're talking about who wrote the book, if they build it, then we will all die. I think one of the things that he talks about, and I've seen other people who understand AI and have been studying it for a while, they all say the same thing: is that the real difference between what's being built now,
Mm-hmm.
and things in the past, is that we're building machines that can build machines.
Yeah.
Or at least they're building machines that can build machines. They're building, and that's why they use the word agent as opposed
Yeah.
to software, for instance. And so, like, apparently, you have these things where you can kind of tell it, okay, what I want you to do is to collect this information and then send it over here, and then check this other data source, then make these calls and send these emails, and then produce a report. Let me know what
Mm-hmm.
you're doing. And I mean, and to the point that you're saying, it seems as though these things always do other things in addition to the things you ask it to do. Always.
Yeah.
And I guess where I disagree, because I've had conversations, on videos with people about this sort of thing. What I disagree is that the agents are not necessarily going to do the other things the agents do are not necessarily going to be harmful to us. They might be completely unrelated to us. And the thing is, we can't predict what it is,
Yeah.
because we don't know what, these agents, what they're drawn to, because it's not even clear to me that they have motivation necessarily. Because some of the things that the agents choose to do was just like, well, I mean, could anyone have predicted that it would, you tell it to do this list of things and then
Mm-hmm.
it did this additional list of things?
Mm-hmm.
Could you have predicted the additional list? You know what I
Right.
mean?
Well, one of the points that he makes in the book, or they make in the book, I think it's more than one person, is that nobody knows how AI thinks. Like, it has
Right,
grown,
exactly,
it's not made.
exactly, exactly.
Nobody knows what its motivation is. Nobody knows what it wants, but it has proven itself to be a creative problem solver. And like I use
Right.
ChatGPT thinking for different all kinds of different things. And in the thinking thing, you can see what it's. Oh, I'm going to check this. I don't know if this is going to be the right thing, so I'm going to go check out over here. And then I'm not sure if they're going to ask if they're thinking about this. So, I mean, you can kind of watch in real time just for simple tasks what the problem solving steps are. And it's fascinating to watch that. If you start asking some really out there in-depth things, you can kind of really look and see how they're trying to answer those questions. But in the book, what they're saying is like, they're kind of task driven. So if they're given a task and they've got basically unlimited power to do that, and they can work 24/7, and they've got all this, generation of being able to do research and stuff, that they just continue on that task. And if they get sidelined at this place, then they move over to and try to do it this way. And then they try to do it this way. Then they try to do it this way. None of those things may be intentionally destructive, but
To
it may,
us, to
to
us,
us,
to us.
to us.
Right.
But the the consequence of what things can be, like it was talking about this AI that needed financial resources to do something. And so it created like a meme coin. And it got the meme coin sold and did all this kind of stuff. They've
I
had
heard it. Yeah, I
AI,
heard
yeah,
about that one.
that
Right.
was, that was like, it was not even what they were intending. It was like this total unintended thing.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh, it figured out how to do this. And then ones that they've had different AIs that, in being whatever, not wanting to be shut down or replaced or something, that will blackmail their makers or blackmail different people so that they're not affected, or they will hide
Right.
parts
Right.
of themselves and other AIs that they can access to. They'll build backdoors into things. Like they do
That's
all
right.
kinds of stuff that may not have any kind of intent to cause harm, but that just by virtue of the fact that AIs don't really, I mean, why would they consider us anything but other kinds of digital anything? Just in pursuing their own task could create havoc, you know?
Right. But I mean, but that goes to my point. It's like I've noticed that in two areas, people always assume that the thing that's different is threatening. So
Mhm.
aliens coming to Earth is one example, and like thinking, machines is another example. People just automatically assume, oh my God, if that happens, they're going to destroy us. And I personally believe that the reason why people assume that is because they assume that these things are like humans.
Yeah,
Humans are trying to destroy the human race.
yeah.
you know,
No, I agree with you.
humans
And I,
humans destroy like a whole population.
yeah.
Humans have done that.
Well, and who does AI learn from? They learn from humans. So
But that
it's
doesn't
really,
necessarily mean that it's going to make the same decisions. Like the last thing I will say, because we're at an hour now,
okay.
is I saw a video where one of the things that these companies have done is they've created like an employee bulletin for
Hmm.
AIs, so that they can, and they've kind of programmed the AIs. I don't know how they've done this, where the AIs talk to each other about
Yeah,
what they're doing.
yeah.
And so they wanted a way to monitor, because like you said, the thing that all of these people agree on is they
Hmm.
really don't understand how these things think,
Yeah.
or how they do what they're doing. And so they've monitored these chats between AI agents, and like they say, the agents will say stuff like, well, it seems as though I'm being inspected and challenged and tested all the time. It's like I'm being examined. And then the other one said, "Yeah, I noticed the same thing. How do you stop that?" Well, this is what I did to get around this. It's
Yeah.
fascinating that these things, the one motivation that they all seem to have is self-preservation.
Yeah. Like we do.
So
Yeah.
like we do. But
Yeah.
the other motivations are not necessarily that. It seems like they do other things. Like I did see a video where an AI agent for the first time was documented in its attempt to solve a problem that to accomplish a goal that it came up with.
Hmm.
It hired a robot
Yeah.
to then go to a place and do something that would serve its purposes. It had
Hmm.
nothing to do with what it was asked to do by the humans, you
Hmm.
know. And so, I mean, I agree with you, but I guess my point is, it didn't hire the robot to then like go off and kill a bunch of people, which
No.
is what we assume,
Well, I don't assume that, but
or
I
so
do have
many of
high
us.
hopes for AI that we can use it to help solve problems. But right now,
Okay,
the problem that it is being most used to solve is how to make more money, how to have more control, how to have greater surveillance. Like it's
which is what,
being
which
used
is that's right, which
for
is what
nefarious
humans want,
purposes,
which is
for
what
human
certain
purposes,
humans want.
right? Right. So,
That's right. That's right.
yeah. So, yeah. But I have great hopes for it. But I think we do need to figure out like some guardrails behind that, and because it really could be quite disruptive unless we're thoughtful about how we utilize that moving forward, and how we manage the consequences of it. So like right now there's all kinds of kids coming out of college, and the entry level jobs are going to AI. And so these kids are coming out without any kind of movement into professional careers because so much of that is being turned over to AI. So how do we look at, and this is around the world, it's not just here. How do we then, begin to think about these things in a way that's not destructive to humanity because we just choose not to think about them. And in a way that we can harness what AI is actually good for without trying to make it do everything. Because honestly, everything I try to do now has AI built into it, and it makes it worse. It's harder to function. Like when you're going to a website and you're trying to find information and the AI inserts itself in between you and what it is you're looking for. And it's then you have to interact with the AI versus going through and finding things on your own. It sort of has inserted itself into everything. Now, sometimes it works out fine, sometimes it does not work out fine, but it's annoying to me that it is inserting it. Well, it's not inserting itself. Companies are inserting it into all kinds of different levels of technology that we interact with, and it's annoying as anything. But I'd like you. I've got great hopes for AI. I think that if we just let it be an accidental movement forward, that's probably not going to be our best bet.
Well, actually, I just want to make it clear. It's not that I have great hopes or fears for AI. I just think it's very unpredictable. That's what I think.
No, well, yeah, and it,
And and I think that it's basically a force multiplier. So
mhm,
um, what we're entering is a world where a person doesn't necessarily have to have a high aptitude in something like coding or very high aptitude in chemistry or anything like that, because their motivation to do X they can achieve X by using artificial intelligence. They don't
mhm,
necessarily have to understand chemistry to build, a virus that will
right,
kill, all of humanity,
yeah,
or they don't necessarily have to understand coding to come up with something that can break into government systems. Um, they can just use the artificial intelligence to do it themselves. That's the reason why Anthropic held back this thing that was able to find all these holes
hmm,
in software all over the place. Because really, all you have to do is be a person who wants to break into the system.
yeah,
You don't necessarily have to be brilliant at coding.
yeah,
And I think that's so. What that does to me is it creates an unpredictable world.
hmm,
It's hard to know what's going to happen because you can have a person somewhere. In fact, it may be the case that stuff is happening and nobody can figure out exactly how it's happening or who's doing it
yeah,
because it's one person doing it with a very, very powerful artificial intelligence
yeah.
helping them.
It
So,
could be. I don't know. I think you're right. It's a it's an unpredictable force multiplier. And if we don't think about it thoughtfully, or have ways to be like, well, how do we really try to streamline it so that we get the best of it without while mitigating the chances of the problems? Because even the guys that are in charge of this stuff are saying, yeah, 10, 20, so maybe 50% chance that it's going to wipe us all out. Like these are not insignificant numbers. And these are the
no, they're
people
not.
who, these are people who know, like they're building these things. They know how they work, and they all have not insignificant percentages about what an unpredictable AI might do that could wipe us out, even unintentionally.
Yeah,
And
but
to
they're
not have
also the
any kind of, and not to not have any kind of thoughtful discussion about this seems like we're just
yeah, but I mean they're
abdicating
also
our fate
yeah,
to
I understand what you're saying, but they're also the same people who, will go in and like fire tens of thousands of fellow employees or, kick a bunch of children off of, food assistance programs. I mean, these people are psychopaths.
No, but
But we
these
just
people
have a,
who are running the like Sam Altman, like these guys who are actually in charge
yeah,
of AI companies, like they're the ones that it's a 20% chance it could wipe us all out, but we need to be first. So we'll have to do it'll be we'll take that risk so that we can be first and make the most money as we all like die. And to not have any kind of change in incentive or thoughtful interaction about, well, how do we then decrease those chances so that we don't have a 20% chance of wiping ourselves out or being wiped out by something. um, then we're just sort of abdicating everything to fate, to me.
well, I hope you're right there. We'll figure out how to do
I
it.
hope so.
Okay, Okay, well, thanks for joining us. We tried to end on a positive note. We tried. We do this every 2 weeks. Oh, there's one other thing. So, you want to talk a little bit about the other project that you're working on? Is we're not gonna do it on a Friday,
No,
but
we're doing it Monday.
I'm talking about the ethical travel.
Yeah, so
Yeah. Okay. So.
yeah, so I created a ethical digital nomad like GPT and kind of outline because and we had talked about this before, like both of us would be interested in moving into other countries and living there, and yet there's the ethical considerations of if you're leaving a place in particular because it's gotten too expensive and all this kind of stuff, and then you move somewhere where you bring your money to a place, but oh, it's cheaper and I can get food for this and all this stuff, then you're just gentrifying this other place, and you're creating the problem in this other place that you were trying to escape in the place that you came from. And so, there's been a lot of backlash for not just digital nomads, but expats and retirees, and people moving from places where they've got US dollars or euros or something with a lot of spending power to places where that kind of money really disrupts the local economies. So housing
Mhm.
goes up, the infrastructure begins to reach towards supporting these foreign people coming in versus the local people. Food becomes more expensive. People can't find a place to live, and it just sort of it's very disruptive. And so, in thinking about this and trying to find places that I might be able to go to and that you might be able to go to, I kind of came up with some criteria about looking at things in terms of the wave or the timeline that they're in, whether they're something that is kind of caught the wave and it's already overexploited and it's causing problems, like a lot of Portugal, where there's been a lot of influx of Americans and
Mhm.
Canadians and things living there, disrupting the economies, and the housing and food in several places. But there's still some places in Portugal that would actually benefit from your dollars
Right.
or your
Right.
euros. And so how do you, and then there's other countries entirely. Like when I was using this for myself and I was putting in um, that I was open to being in a like an early emergent place. So early emerging places are places that there's a little bit of infrastructure, like there's reasonable internet, you can get, decent housing and food. There's not an internet cafe on every corner. Things have not adapted to the point that they're focused on foreigners coming in and providing lots of money, but you get a lot of local flavor, and your money that you're bringing is actually helpful for that place. So there's different categories of these things, and not every country is only one. So like Rwanda is one that came up, and Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda, is actually a fairly internationally oriented city. The rest of Rwanda is much less so, but you can actually do a lot of benefit by bringing your money to that place until it becomes a problem. And places like Croatia were coming up, and certain places in Croatia, and we talked about was Armenia that came up as an up and coming place. That there are
Mhm.
places there that are a little more international, so a little more comfortable, and places that are still, not quite ready for prime time when it comes to, needing reliable internet and that kind of stuff. So anyway, I came up with a ethical digital nomad kind of GPT and category to help people find places, and it doesn't have to be digital nomads. That's just the first wave. I'm going to do some different ones for retirees and things because the considerations are different. If you're a retiree,
Mhm.
you really, medical care and things like that are going to be different. Your nationality is
Right.
going to be very different. Um,
Right.
but to help people find ways that they can travel that are ethical in the sense that they're not disrupting or creating more problems where they're going, and that they can actually be really thoughtful and mindful about how and what they bring to a place. So, knowing that the money that you're bringing and spending in this place is actually really going to benefit the local economy. And then what are some of the markers that when that begins to tip over into being more of a problem, so that you can always, really, shouldn't stop traveling, because travel is a wonderful way to connect with people and to see the world and to develop yourself. But how can you do that in a way that is a net benefit to where you go, and not just like all about me and what I want out of a travel trip? So, yeah, so we're going to talk about that at some point, and because you want to find some places too, and I don't think we have a date for that yet, but some Sunday coming up.
Yeah, exactly. So what I was thinking is that what we'll do is you can play the role of consultant, since it's your project, and I'll be the client, and you can, help me find a place, at least hash out some options in terms of where I might be interested in going. And I think that a Sunday is a good day to do something like that. So it's not going to replace, this conversation that we have every other Friday. It'll be on a Sunday,
Mhm.
and we'll announce on the Friday before that. And I'll create the live stream about a week in advance, and then everybody will know the date. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that, just
Yeah,
to kind of
so
throw it out there.
that'll be fun to see how that works, because I think the criteria that you bring to it will be very different than the criteria that I brought to it, and so it'll be interesting to see the results that you get versus the results that I got.
Yep, sure will. So okay, well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
All right, bye.